Welcome to this lecture on the social impacts of environmental crisis. I'm calling it the bottleneck because many sociologists and environmentalists are using that term to talk about several converging issues that all societies are beginning to face and which will become more critical in the coming years. Here we provide an overview of these four interrelated environmental issues: resource degradation, population, energy, and climate change. Along the way, we'll highlight the social impacts of these issues. One way to grasp the link between how we live and our environment is via the concept of ecological footprint, which is why I've included a link to a footprint calculator in this week's folder. Your ecological footprint is a ballpark measure of your impact on the environment, based in part on how much productive land is required to sustain you. Globally, there are 1.8 hectares of land available per person, but the average ecological footprint is already 2.8 hectares per person. Americans have the largest footprint on the planet at 9.6 hectares, and Bangladeshis the smallest at half a hectare. In the few minutes it will take you to calculate your own footprint, you'll get a result both in terms of hectares and in terms of how many planets we would need if everyone lived like you do. And that's the problem. As you can see from this graph, since the 1970s, humans have been overdrawn at the bank in terms of our ecological footprint. We're increasingly using more of the Earth's resources than can be regenerated. But let's make this more concrete and zero in on one resource. Fish is a key source of protein for much of the world's population, and you can see here that we've been incredibly careless with that resource. Many species of fish are in an irreversible spiral of decline. In terms of the social impacts of the decline of a crucial resource like this, we know that social conflict between groups competing for a diminishing resource are inevitable. And in fact, there are many ongoing social conflicts today that are rooted in a scramble for an endangered resource. So, the social violence of science fiction, such as the Mad Max series, may not be so far from the truth. The second environmental issue we look at here is that of population. And you can already grasp how integrally it is linked to the issue of resource degradation. We know that global population has grown rapidly in the last 200 years, but the issue is not how many of us there are on Earth, it is how we use the planet's resources. Here we combine global population on the horizontal axis and ecological footprint on the vertical axis. So you can see that North America has the highest ecological footprint of any other region in the world, but a relatively small proportion of the world's total population. By contrast, look at Asia Pacific, second to the right in red. Low ecological footprint, but huge population, which, by the way, includes India and China. Both countries are rapidly industrializing and have equally rapid population growth. What will happen to pressure on the planet's resources when their ecological footprint doubles or triples? The other thing about global population growth is that it is proceeding apace with growing social inequality. You may have noticed from the previous slide that the United States has about 5% of the world's population and uses about a third of its resources. Since rich people consume a lot more resources than poor people do, we can anticipate an increase in social conflict between rich and poor as the supply of each resource thins out. Again, a good deal of science fiction from the last 30 years, from Blade Runner to Children of Men, has already painted a vivid picture of this. The third environmental issue we look at here is energy, specifically oil. Crude oil is not only the source of our automotive fuels, it is also the platform that the world's economy rests on. Without cheap and plentiful oil, we would not have the consumer goods that are still affordable after the 12,000-kilometer journey from the factory to the retail outlet. However, oil is a non-renewable resource. Back in the 1950s, an oil company geoscientist hypothesized that there would be a point where oil production peaks and then begins to decline. Not so much because we'd be running out, but because of the increasing costs of extracting more hard-to-reach reserves. Hence the peak oil hypothesis. The point of this is that once peak oil has been reached, the whole game has to change. What if the supply of oil begins to decline, but not the demand for it? This slide combines global oil production data, and as you can see, we may even be in the peak oil zone now. Here we zoom in a little closer on the last few years. Peak oil is not only a hypothesis, it is a certainty. The only guesswork in a complicated world is when, and also how societies will begin to feel its effects. For starters, we can easily project that the price of anything that has to travel a long ways from its point of production will start to increase. Meanwhile, demand for oil continues to climb. The fourth and last environmental issue we look at is, of course, climate change. The fact of human-caused climate change is by now well established in the scientific world, but we are only just beginning to grasp what all of the social impacts of climate change will be. This issue is very close to home with the recent release of a government report showing that Canada's climate is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world, and northern Canada at 3 times the global average. One very dramatic impact of climate change is the rise in sea levels, which so far has been proceeding more rapidly than projected. Looking here at the coastline of Florida, you can see the catastrophic impact a 5-meter rise in sea levels would have on heavily populated areas. In poor parts of the world, such as the Asian subcontinent, with millions of people living near sea level, the impacts would be devastating. So we come back now to the metaphor of an environmental bottleneck to focus on the social impacts of the issues we've looked at. First, in terms of pressure on the Earth's resources, it's safe to predict an increase in social conflict in areas where groups are competing over a declining resource. Second, social inequalities in societies will function as an amplifier of environmental crisis. Third, as the fossil fuel platform of our way of life comes under pressure from the rising costs of fossil fuels, we can expect a lot of social and economic impacts, not the least of which will be the rising cost of the lifestyles we have gotten used to. Finally, climate change will, among other things, be a catalyst for large-scale human migration as populations free flooded areas and climate zones that have become intolerably hot. Food production will also be disrupted with each shift in climate. Of course, we need to be reminded that none of these unsettling outcomes is inevitable. Everything will depend on choices made by us now and in the next few years. Thanks for listening in.